Welcome to Living Under the Cross. I'm Pastor David. What is your response to difficult situations? Some people get angry, others run away and hide, still others throw their hands up into the air and surrender to the circumstances of life, following the will of the crowd or the trends in society. The difficult situation that is facing millions of people in Canada and around the world today is the presence of and the response by governments to COVID. What will it mean for our lives day by day, and how will it impact how we celebrate Christmas this year? Make no mistake, for many, the challenge of COVID will test our character. And this is just as true for Christians as for others. The Apostle Paul understood this sort of difficulty in his own life, but he also saw other Christians facing challenges in their daily lives. Take, for example, the Christians in the town of Colossae. They had to deal with economic decline, religious syncretism, frequent earthquakes, and persecution from their neighbors, their family, and their friends. Into this difficult time for the Christians, Paul wrote them a letter of exhortation and encouragement, giving them the key to living above their circumstances. In the 3rd chapter, verses 1 to 17, we read the following. Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways, in the life you once lived. But now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its Creator. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace, and be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. Whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. On the 29th of November, we will begin the Advent season, trying to do what we can that is traditional in a time when so much is not normal. Governments have set restrictions upon what we can do, and so that we might not be able to do what many of us have always done. The temptation is to either give in to fear and despair or to get angry and defiant, which in all circumstances are the wrong answers. Fight or flight might be the Darwinist solution to life's problems, but it's not the Christian way. Every single challenge in life is an opportunity to demonstrate Christ at work in our lives. And yes, I know that we can and do all fail at times to live up to the high standards of Jesus, but that is not a reason to give up living and acting like a Christian. The danger for the believer is to give in to despair or to react with anger at difficult or hurtful situations. At those times we can fall into sin and walk away from the idea of living holy lives in unity with God's people. God's agape love, His benevolent affection, gets supplanted by all sorts of sins. Considering that we live in a society where being a victim is considered the most noble of positions, the temptation to feel like a victim is very strong, even though a victim mentality is at its core childish, selfish, and ultimately evil. In the book of Colossians, Paul reminds us that we must not live with a worldly attitude, not even a victim mentality, focused on the things and situations around us. Rather, we are to set our hearts on things above, not on earthly things. The Christian whose eyes are on worldly things will ultimately fall into sin, and we are warned to fight against such things. In fact, we are commanded to put to death and rid ourselves of them as we set our hearts on things above. Paul gives two lists of sins, evil attitudes and actions which bring God's wrath, both in this life and on the day of judgment. One would think that this list is self-evident, but there are people who call themselves Christians today, and there have been people who called themselves Christians in the past, who have looked at these lists and saw nothing sinful in them. It is the same old list of sins that Paul repeatedly warns believers to avoid. One might think that the temptation, even for believers in these lists, are serious. So what are we to put to death? Sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. What is it we are to rid from our lives? Anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language, and lying to each other. The first list should be self-evident to the believer in Jesus. Yet it is amazing how many today in the church at large think that greed is a noble pursuit, and there are even Christians who put their blessing upon sexual immorality. The second list is a little more problematic for many Christians. Some practice a form of self-righteousness and legalism, which leads to a violent passion for vengeance, breathtaking indignation, a depravity which seeks evil things to happen to others, blasphemy, which is to speak evil against God, His church, and His children, vile conversation of all kinds, and bearing false witness to each other and about each other. How did I get that out of anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language, and lying to each other, you might ask? Well, that is exactly what those words mean in the original Greek of the text. And that is exactly what happens in churches and in Christians who have not clothed themselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. As Christians, we are called to be, more we are commanded to be, compassionate, kind, humble, gentle, and patient in every aspect of our lives. This can be quite hard in difficult times when we are facing not just the normal pressures of life, but the oppression of difficulty. It does not matter what the hard times are, whether they come about because of disease, the action of government, the loss of a job, the passing into eternity of a loved one, or the betrayal of a friend. There are lots of things in life which can make life hard. How we deal with the hard times, when life gets in our face and annoys us, offends us, or knocks us flat on our back, is a sign of whether or not we are clothed with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. I know that not everything on this list fits into the modern way of living, but they are meant to be part of the Christian way of living. Further, if we live clothed with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, then we will live following the command of Jesus to forgive 70 times 7 times. The thing about forgiveness is that it does not make a big show like the hypocrites who announce their good deeds with trumpets. If you turn to the Gospel of Luke in chapter 17, you'll see there suggested that forgiveness is not supposed to take weeks, months, or even years. To go off and sulk and make a big show of being hurt is abusive and a sin before Almighty God. As one evangelist stated, to make a big production of our hurt is to spit in the face of the one who said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Our culture is great at making mountains out of molehills, but Christians should be experts at making molehills out of mountains. How can we live clothed with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience when we are asked to live with our hearts open and vulnerable to others? If we live with our hearts open and vulnerable to others, it only means that they will hurt us. Some have decided the best solution is to build a wall around our hearts so that nobody can get in, nobody can hurt us. Is this the best solution? Hardly. To build a wall around our hearts is to cut ourselves off, not only from others, but from God. We can only do this allowing ourselves to be hurt over and over again by a misspoken word, or being let down by someone we trust, by keeping our eyes focused on heavenly things. How can we tell if somebody does not have their eyes on Jesus? It is because they are filled with anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy languages, or lies. How can we know someone does have their eyes focused on things above? It is because they are clothed with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Over the top of all these virtues, Christians are to practice the agape love of God and to live in peace with each other and with God. Yes, I know, as Tolkien said, it takes one to make a war and not two. I also know that those who do not live by the sword can still die by the sword. But this does not mean that those who wish us harm should ever have the power to steal from us the peace of Christ, which is meant to live and rule in our hearts. I even know that there will be wolves in sheep's clothing who come in to rend and destroy the flock. But even they are powerless to destroy our peace and love if Christ reigns supreme in our hearts. This is the challenge to every believer, to decide whether our spirituality and morality are determined by circumstances or by Jesus. In the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, "In times of famine, even a good man will eat his own children." But the followers of Jesus are called to live beyond circumstances and to follow Jesus at all times, because the agape love of God resides in them and is over them in all things. How can we know when a Christian or a church is not living under and in the agape love of God? We see it in the divided church. We see it in the hateful heart. A divided church, an unpeaceful heart, a resentful, unkind, haughty, rough, and impatient spirit is never governed by God's love. Unity, compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience are all signs that God reigns in a church and in a person's life. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that if we are loving to those we think are loving to us, that we have done something extraordinary. Not at all. It is only when we are loving towards those we think are unloving to us that we show God's benevolent affection to each other. Unity does not happen because we all agree on everything, or even that we all agree on the right way to do ministry. Unity happens when we determine to love and not to hate, when we determine to forgive and not to resent, and not to allow circumstances of life to dictate our Christian faith to us. We are about to enter into the season of Advent for 2020, and we are going to have to celebrate in new ways. If we are going into Advent dominated by the circumstances around us, then it may very well be a meaningless exercise. If, however, we celebrate Advent with our eyes on Jesus, our hearts in unity, and the circumstances of life powerless to touch our love for God and each other, then this Advent could be a powerful reminder of God's grace and love for us. Our joy should be rock solidly built upon the hope we have in Jesus, not the difficulties we experience in life. Today, if you are filled with anxiety, anger, resentment, and hurt feelings, it's time to get rid of them. Turn your eyes back towards heaven. Turn your eyes back towards Jesus. Fix your heart on heavenly things. Surrender again to the agape love of God and allow Him to revive your failing heart. I urge you to celebrate Advent, clothed with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, in unity and forgiving hurts, overcoming difficulties with the agape love of Jesus Christ.